Shalom, good evening. Welcome to the practical Parsha for Parshat Tisa, or Tisa, on page 220 in our Chumash, and that is chapter 30, verse 11. The first mitzvah in this Parsha is the mitzvah of the half shekel, which they gave as an atonement. But I want to focus in the next mitzvah, which is the beginning of verse 17. Okay, so that's Shemos, Exodus, chapter 30, verse 17. And it begins. Hashem spoke to Moshe saying, make a copper wash basin. This is the kior. And its copper base for washing. And place it between the tent of meeting and the altar and put water in it. Aaron and his sons will wash from it their hands and their feet. Before entering the tent of meeting, they must wash with water, and they will not die. Or whenever they approach the altar for divine service, or to burn a fire offering to Hashem. They must wash their hands and their feet, and they will not die. This is a perpetual statute for them, for him, meaning for Aaron, and for all his descendants, for all generations. So this is the mitzvah of washing their hands and their feet prior to either entry into the tent of meeting, into the main abode, okay, the main chamber of the Bet HaMikdash. The Bet HaMikdash was the Heichal, the main hall, and or when they're offering any whatsoever type of service, they need to wash their hands and their feet. Nowadays, this concept still exists. It may not be directly from this particular type of wash basin. In fact, we don't have this wash basin. It's somewhere. It was made by Moshe, so it's somewhere there, somewhere hidden in the Temple Mount. This actual copper wash basin is existed. We'll see it when Mashiach comes. But as far as our service to Hashem, as I'll explain in a moment, as far as we are concerned, we need to wash our hands every day. And therefore I chose today's topic, the practical application of the Parsha, is the idea and the laws concerning the washing of the hands. In Judaism, the washing of the hands takes up a very special place. In the day, in the life of a Jew, every single day. And throughout the day, there are various opportunities at which we have to wash our hands. And then the opportunities in which we can elect to, for example, like we do on Shabbat, when we eat bread. When you break bread, you need to wash your hands. And I'm going to try to give you a general, basic overview of the laws and the details concerning this mitzvah. Again, as I always do, I want to point out, this is not going to be a comprehensive rendition of all the laws, but just as an idea, and of course you need to refer to the Shulchan Aruch, to the Code of Jewish Law, for any questions, or to a competent rabbi if you have any detailed questions. This is just general to give you an idea what this mitzvah is all about. So let's go for it. First and foremost, in the morning, when a Jew wakes up in the morning, the first thing you need to do is wash your hands. How do we wash our hands? Why do we wash our hands? Let me explain. There are two general reasons given for why it's necessary, or imperative, I should say, to wash our hands as soon as we get up in the morning. The first one actually connects to this. The first reason is because a Jew is a servant of God. Each day when we wake up, we're waking up for another full day of service to Hashem. True, there's some parts of the day that are obvious services to Hashem, such as the prayers we do in the morning, the blessings we do in the morning, the tefillin we put on, the Torah study. But make no mistake, even when we go to work and we go about what seems to be our own mundane tasks, these are also part of our service for Hashem, because they either contribute or in fact are directly part of what Hashem wants us to do. without going to work, without generating an income, we wouldn't have the food to sustain ourselves, to survive, to exist, in order to be able to do the service. It all comes together. So whenever we wake up in the morning, we're waking up for a day of service. And just like the Kohanim, the priests, when they were about to devout on the service for the day, they had to actually wash their hands. So too, it says in Shulchan Aruch, is the reason why we have to wash our hands. Another reason that's given, which is equally important, and you'll see it also has ramifications in terms of the imperativeness of this, and what happens to water and so on, is that when we sleep at night, it says in the Talmud that sleep is like a 60th of death. And in fact, you can see it in some way. To some degree, when a person's asleep, they're not functioning. Their body is there, and similar to, God forbid, when someone's dead, the body can be fully intact, the eyes are fully there, the mouth is fully there, everything is there, but you're not talking, you're not hearing, you're not seeing, you're not functioning. It's because the soul, in that case, fully departs from the body. In this case, the soul is there, the imagination is still working, and so on, but the fact is, while you're sleeping, you're not talking, you're not eating. So this is a taste of death. Death is impurity, and we've already spoken about that. So the fact that when a person wakes up, that death that enveloped the entire body leaves from the person, the soul re-emerges, so to speak, comes back alive in the person's body, fully functioning. The person's awake, the person's up. The nails, without getting into too much detail, are that last final part of the body where the impurity sticks to, the tips of the fingers. Thus, we need to wash it in that specific manner, which is 6 times total, 3 on each hand, but alternatively, okay, without getting into the Kabbalah of it, but that's what removes the impurity. And then you're clean. So for these two reasons combined, we need to wash our hands in the morning. By the way, why is it important to know that these are the 2 reasons? What difference is it? We need to wash our hands. Well, the answer is that there are instances where a person did not sleep overnight, but rather slept during the day, more than a half hour, or let's say an hour or so. By all given opinions, you need to wash your hands. Maybe not necessarily near your bed, as well I'll describe in a moment, as you would when you sleep overnight. But certainly you need to wash your hands before you touch any food, before you do any tasks of holiness and so on.
Oh yeah.
What happens now if somebody didn't sleep all night? If you were awake all night? Well, if you only followed the second reason, I never slept, so I never really incurred any death. I should actually say that there are opinions that even if one was up all night, it's not the matter so much of sleeping that brings upon that impurity, it's the night. Think of it, the darkness of night that brings some little substance, some little residue of impurity on the person. But in any case, even if I was up all night, I am now taking on a whole new day. Once that sun rises, a whole new day of service to Hashem, Shacharit, Mincha, Ma'ariv, Torah study, Tzedakah, Tefillin, whatever it is. So I need to wash my hands. So either way, once it's daybreak, and even if you're up all night, you need to wash your hands. Now, because we consider this water to be removing impurity, the water should not be used for anything, and is in fact should be discarded in a place that says where nobody would walk there, nobody would step on it barefoot, nobody would, worse, even drink it, certainly not, but nobody would touch it. Why? Because there's a quote-unquote a bad spirit on that water.
Yes.
Okay, so therefore typically they pour the water out in the toilet bowl, let it go down with all the waste. But if you're pouring it out somewhere, if you don't have that, let's say you're out in the camp somewhere, always pour it somewhere in a place where you're certain that people won't walk there. Now, it's customary, especially by those who follow the Hasidic Kabbalistic teachings, to be extra careful and wash their hands right near the bed. Meaning, before going to sleep, you prepare a basin, because you don't want to pour it on the floor, with a washing cup, which I'll talk about in a moment. And according to the Zohar, according to the Arizal, that is, not to even put your feet on the floor without washing your hands. In Shulchan Aruch, in the Code of Jewish Law, it says you shouldn't walk more than 4 cubits, which is about 7 feet. Okay, and some argue, well, you're in certain in a certain sense, okay, in some applications of law, your whole room or your whole house might be considered like your own personal space, which is the 4 cubits. So some say, well, I don't have it. I get up from bed and go to the sink and wash my hands. I can't say it's not true. But following the teachings of the Kabbalah, the Zohar that is, and especially of the teachings of the Arizal, Rabbi Yitzchak Luria, certainly you don't even put your feet off the bed. And actually, we're actually strongly cautioned from touching anything, especially places where have openings, like your eyes, your nose, your mouth, touching anything before washing your hands. So typically you see people going, I don't know if you see it in the movie, the first thing you wake up, you start rubbing your eyes. No. First thing you wake up is, you say the Modani, which we spoke about once, and you bend over. And it takes a little training to get used to being in your bed and hanging over and washing, the thing on the floor. If you needed to, you can have it on a chair near you. Okay? You have little kids, it might not be so practical. You got to know when to strategically put your water there and make it hang over. But in any case, always make sure to immediately discard that. It's one of the issues I have at Pet Peeves. I tell my kids, you can't leave it around. The little kids don't know. They come in, they see water, they stop playing with it. That water they're playing with is not just innocent water, it's bad spirit in it. Spill it out right away. You know what I'm saying? It's almost like look at it as a contaminant, literally as a contaminant, as something which poses a danger. Okay?
Well, you do the Modani and then you wash your hands.
And then you wash your hands and then you go out of bed. And then you go out of bed.
Okay.
Then you rub your eyes, whatever you need to do. Okay?
Yeah, well, one can always buy like a little side stand table with a basin.
Whatever makes you happy. But the idea is the basin. Now, let's talk a little bit about when one is meant to wash their hands. It means we just spoke about when you wake up in the morning. Interestingly, even though you woke up in the morning and you washed your hands, you're always going to be washing your hands a second time before you start saying the actual morning blessings, before you start to pray.
Yeah.
Why is that? Because there are other times when you have to wash your hands, and that is any time one goes to the bathroom. Even when you touch what's called the typically covered parts of your body. Parts of the body that would typically be covered. I know for some people it's up for interpretation, but we're talking about what a normal person would typically, cover, till the elbows. Certainly, the rule of thumb is places that usually have drops of sweat. If you could sweat, you have to wash your hands. That's considered to be impurity. That's considered to be something dirty. You cut your nails, you cut your hair, went to the bathroom, got dressed, you need to wash your hands. And again, the same way 6 times, which is 3 and 3 alternatively. And that's why after we woke up, after we got dressed, we went to the bathroom, washed up, take a shower. When you bathe, we take a shower and so on. You're typically going to touch parts of your body that are there. You should. You're going to use soap, right?
Of course.
So you got dressed. It's inevitable. So then you need to wash your hands again. Okay? And it's good to getting into the habit of it. And actually, I remember somebody mentioned on Shabbat, which is very interesting, that we know that during the Black Plague, a lot of the anti-Semites accused the Jews of having poisoned the waters, of having been the cause for the Black Plague, and it caused terrible, terrible pogroms and so on. But every lie has to have some truth. It has to have some truth to be the cohesiveness. What was some truth? Because it was true. It was true. Disproportionately, the Jews were dying and being affected much less by the plague. Why is it?
Because of the washing of the hands.
To wash their hands. Every time to wash your hands, you leave the bathroom, you got to wash your hands. And you got to rub your hands, and you have to wipe your hands in a towel. Part of washing the hands is wiping the hands.
Truly
dry. I'm not
dry.
going to get into that detail. You need to learn the code of Jewish law, which washing of the hands actually is considered incomplete if you haven't wiped your hands. Some of them it's okay if you didn't wipe. Some of you need to actually wipe your hands. The idea is, if you know anything about cleanliness, when you the friction that you're rubbing your hands together will actually take away all the bacteria and all the diseases. So basically not take away that contagious element. So basically, you see the benefit of it. You leave the bathroom, you touch a sweaty part of the body, and so on. You bathe, wash your hands. Now we're doing it also for a ritual, but this for ritual purposes. But this is almost like the fringe benefit of following the thing. I'm not saying that's the reason. I'm just saying the fringe benefit of following the halakha. Now, what is the requirement? What is the criteria for washing the hands? In other words, what do I need? Any water? Does the water have to come from somewhere? So there's 3 basic criteria, which ideally all 3 should be met. And that is, first of all, you need to have a kli. It has to come out of a vessel. It has to come out of some type of vessel that contains the water. Meaning, in some way, just for this purpose of this, if you have a waterfall, there's water freely pouring, that's fresh water, fresh as you can get. But that's not good for Netilat Yadayim. It needs to come from actual kli. Now that, just giving you the basic rules, a bottle such as this would not be kosher. Remember, kosher means fit, would not meet the criteria. This cup definitely will. Although you may not have enough here for all 6 times, but since it holds at least a revi'it, which is about 3-4 ounces, that's the minimum, because that's the minimum you need to cover 2 hands minimally, precisely. And it has, and here's the main point, it has an even
open mouth,
where the water pours evenly, pours out. Whereas, for example, if you have a pitcher and you're pouring it from the place of the spout, that's not kosher. If this is broken, if it cannot contain the water, it happens to hold the water, so if I quickly grab it and wash my hands, yes, I get most of the water, but since this is not a whole vessel, it's not going to be kosher. So you get the idea, it has to be kosher. Now, the typical washing cup that we have, very practical, and it makes sense, has the 2 handles on it. It doesn't have to have 2 handles. Instead, I can use the cup. It's just when using the cup, when you're transferring it, you might get an issue here, especially if it's a small cup. You might start touching one hand that has not been washed yet, touching the hand that has been washed, and now you cross-contaminate. Now you have to wipe your hands and wash all over again. So it's very practical when you have 2 handles.
Yeah.
This is the right hand, this is the left hand, and that. Incidentally, when we're talking about that when you have a cup, which is the ideal one with the 2 handles, the proper way to do it is, and you'll soon see why this is so important, the proper way to do it is to lift it in your right hand, pass it to your left hand, and now pour on your right hand. And the reason for it is everything that we do, every mitzvah we do, and we spoke about the power of the right, we spoke about it last week's class, right? You put on the right side first and everything, should come from the power of the right hand. But it's impossible for the right hand to pour water on itself evenly from the right hand. It must be done with the left hand. But in order for it to have that element of power in the right hand, you're lifting up the cup first with the right hand and passing it to the left. Thus, it came from the right hand. Okay? So it's not only the right hand that's being poured on, but the power of it came. The initial power came from the right hand. Moving forward, we spoke about the vessel generally. Now we talk about the water. The water has to be basic clean water. It doesn't necessarily have to be drinking water. Okay? But it has to be water at least that is not so degraded that an animal would drink from it. You understand? If even an animal wouldn't drink from it, a dog or a cow, then it's so degraded, or if it has filth in it, or if the water's been used for something. So if you have the runoff from dishes or something, you say, well, the water is not impure, and maybe it's drinkable, just rinse dishes. But the water's already been, so to speak, abused. It's been used for something already. It's no longer appropriate.
Well, you don't give it the first priority it needs.
Exactly. It needs to be ideally good,
prioritized,
fresh, clean water, but it does not have to be any special water. It does not have to come from any special place. If anybody tries to sell you washing water, that and snake oil will get you very far.
Yeah.
I'm talking about the seller, make a lot of money maybe, but not the buyer. It's worthless, absolutely worthless and meaningless. Just going to be taken for a ride. You understand? You get the gist of it. And again, for more detail, look at the Code of Jewish Law, but it's got to be water. And here's the most important part. And this is typical to sometimes happen by mistake, inadvertently, but you should know that not only can the water has to be pure, it has to be unused, but it has to be pure in the ritual sense. So now what happens is if the water is in the wash basin and by mistake I stuck my finger in it as I was grabbing it. That's why it's good when you have the 2 handles on the side. Once I stuck my finger in it, all the water has become now impure because the water is impure. The only time you stick your finger on an impure object into water and the entire body of water doesn't become impure is if the water is connected to the ground. Literally. That's why a mikvah A ritual bath is typically like a pool in the ground or connected, cemented to the ground. What happens then? Even when so many people who are impure go into the mikvah, it doesn't render the water impure. Why? Because anything that's connected to the ground does not absorb impurity. But in this case, it's in a separate wash cup. And then once you touch it, so you have to be careful not to stick your hands into it, not to stick your finger into it before you use the water to pour onto your hand, onto your fingers. Then you need something called koach gavra, literally meaning a human power. That means the water cannot be free-running water, even if it's fresh, I said, and even if it's coming from it means if you, for example, take the wash basin and put it at the end of the table and just let the water just pour out and just stick your hand under 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. You didn't do the mitzvah. You need to actually pour it on the hand. Now, if you can't do it yourself, you can ask someone else to pour it, but it's got to come from a force of a human. The interesting thing is, and this can happen, especially if you're traveling on the road and you don't have what I would call sometimes even the luxury, even of a wash basin or washing like that. And by the way, typically always you can go in always and get one of those big cups, and I said to you a cup is perfectly fine that they have by the vending machines. Or if you don't have that, so now we need all three. We need water, fresh water that nothing has been used, it hasn't been used for anything. We need to have it coming from a kli, from an actual vessel, and we need to have the power of the human. So now remember, if I open the faucet and it stays open, only the first initial pour of water came directly from my energy, from my force, from my doing. Whatever comes after that is only coming as a result of my lack of shutting it, or my lack of turning it off. So what you could do is, if you have no other choice, you don't have a cup, whatever, again, this is if, in the absence of any other option, you could open and close it. So the first thrust that comes on, you open the faucet, or you push it open, and you have your hand up there. You push it open, you have it. So that first gush of water that comes out is coming as a direct result.
Well, it comes out because you actually...
No, you're not touching the water. You're not touching the water. You're touching the faucet. You're touching the mechanism. You're not touching the water. That's perfectly fine. Okay. And you're getting that thrust that you're coming, right? You understand? And it's coming directly from you. Come have a seat. And it's coming, and it's from a vessel. They should consider the pipe is some form of a vessel, correct? It contains water. It's flowing through it. So you get that. Again, if you have no other option, no other way of meeting all three. So this is generally the idea of washing the hands. This comes for washing the hands for removing ritual impurity. Now, of course, there are other washings of the hand, and that is, first of all, which is very prevalent, before a meal, before we wash the bread, correct? When we eat bread, and this is only bread, you need to wash your hands. And I'm not talking about cleanliness here, because in fact, I should note, and this is very important, if you're washing your hands and your hands are dirty, and the water is not coming in full and absolute contact with your skin, you haven't washed your hands. The water has to come in contact with the skin. Furthermore, even if you have dirt under your nails, then the washing is not complete, because it has to be able to reach every part of your exposed body. So therefore, when washing the hands, remember always, prior to that, to remove any impurities, anything that's not clean, anything that shouldn't be there, okay? And there's a lot to be said about, let's say, people who work with, typically have their hands, let's say people who work in a printing press, and they typically have ink on their hands, and that's not considered secondary to them. Or people who that might be different, and again, you got to refer to the code of Jewish law. But as a general rule, your hands have to first be clean. So we're not talking about here about having clean hands for eating. That you need to do always, even if you're not eating bread. We're speaking about specifically, we're referring to the ritual washing that comes before eating bread. And that actually is different. Remember the rule, when you're not removing impurity, you're just adding an extra level of purity, of ritual purity, then you pour 3 on one side, 3 on the other side, okay? Likewise, there's another washing the hand which not applied to anyone here in the room, unless you're a Kohen, the Kohanim, the priests, when they do the priestly blessing on the festivals, or in Israel they do it every Shabbat, some places do it every day, since the priestly blessing is part of their service, their special service as Kohanim, they need to wash their hands before they do that. Now another thing to be said about washing the hands, and it's important to note, that before we any mitzvah, especially before we pray, we should always be mindful of this, that we need to wash our hands a little bit. We may not have to wash it again 6 times, alternating one to the other, because we're not here to remove total and absolute impurity, but just as a prep, as a show of reverence, as a show of eagerness. It says, Su'u Yadechem Kodesh, lift your hands up in holiness and praise Hashem. So always, typically, that's why you'll see in every synagogue, situated in a very strategic place, as people walk into the synagogue or somewhere around the entrance to the actual prayer hall, there's always going to be a wash basin. There's always going to be a sink. There's always going to be there. And it actually was considered in yesteryear, when they didn't have sinks like we have now, where you had plumbing hooked up to the city plumbing and just naturally the water just came in, it was considered to be an honor to be able to provide the water for to be the water carrier or to pay the water carrier, so people when they come in on their way in can wash their hands before prayer. So I'm just saying, before you do a mitzvah, any mitzvah, it's always good. And also, just in case you touch something inadvertently, you touch your shoes, you touch parts, like I said before, a covered part of your body, a part of your body that's typically covered, always a good idea to wash your hands and, just a little bit. If not, even just put it under the faucet or drop just to get your hands wet. Okay?
20 seconds. It's the...
Well, 20 seconds is to remove bacteria. Any questions about this matter? Anything? Okay, I think that basically sums it up. And again, it's worth reviewing these laws in the Code of Jewish Law. And typically you'll find it, especially with the earlier part of our discussion, in one of the very first few chapters in the Code of Jewish Law, because that's where it speaks about getting up in the morning. And then later, after the prayer, typically after the morning prayer, where you have the laws pertaining to the Seudah, to the typical meal of the day, where people will need to wash their hands.
I believe also you should remove all rings and everything from your hand.
Of course, you need to know. Not you believe. It's true. I'm sorry. Thank you for pointing it out. I failed to mention. Yes, you need to remove the rings, because again, remember, especially when the rings are tight, even though it's natural to be there, but they're not going to allow the water to go through, and that could be an interruption, and then you haven't washed your full hand. Okay? I want to mention one more thing. Thanks for pointing it out. You need to wash your hands until your wrists. Okay? The minimum is until the knuckles. And why is it important to know the minimum? Because that one time a year that we're not supposed to wash our hands for pleasure, which is Yom Kippur.
Yes.
It's the only time of the year that we wash our hands only till here. Why? Because that's the minimum. So anything more than that is already not absolutely imperative, and therefore it's considered to be more like a luxury. But otherwise, you're always supposed to wash until your wrist. And another thing is, while your hands are still wet, always be in the habit of keeping your hands up. Why? Because if you wash past your hip and the water is dripping back, it might be considered, again now, impure.
Yeah, that's part of your other body.
Cross-contamination. Okay? That finishes the class, and again, I think it's a good idea to review the laws. And thank you so much for participating.